Good morning. Welcome to the LinkedIn Speaker Series. I'm Ben Casnocha. I am a co-author with Reid of our forthcoming book, The Alliance, Managing Talent in the Networked Age. And today we have a true treat of both Reid and Jeff in conversation together and with me to talk about the themes of the new book, which all of you will be getting a copy of shortly. I'm excited to...
That's always a good applause line.
Start with the winning line. So the way this is gonna work is I'm gonna ask Reid a few questions about how the book came together, the core thesis of the book. Jeff has also been instrumental in helping shape the ideas of the Alliance, and will add a unique perspective for how he thinks about this in the context of LinkedIn today, as well as drawing upon his past experiences. So Reid, let's get right into it. What is the thesis of the Alliance?
The thesis of the Alliance kind of starts with looking at a problem in the relationship between companies and employees. Because one of the things that if you ask most employees and you say, do you think you're going to be working at this company your entire life? The answer will be, I can't really conceive of that, or for the majority, I don't really see that happening. Maybe it might, but I don't necessarily know that'll happen. And if you ask most companies, what do you actually think that your employees will take jobs elsewhere? They look at their HR data and they see that actually, in fact, employees are now moving around between different companies. Yet, that doesn't enter into, across the US, does not enter into, and most of the world, does not enter into the conversation that managers have with employees. So essentially what you have is this kind of like, I know that I might be working somewhere else. On the employee side, not surfaced. On the manager side, not surfaced. And that lack of transparency and conversation about that creates essentially an implicit lack of trust, which needs to be fixed. And part of the reason this needs to be fixed is not just in good culture and good kind of honesty, integrity in the conversation, and a kind of a realistic framework for talking about how to accomplish the work, how to affect the employee's trajectory, but also how do you create investment for companies, and how do you create adaptable organizations? Because part of what happens, the people who recognized this years ago all started advocating kind of free agent nation. They said, oh, no, yes, lifetime employment's gone, and now, it's I think we quoted Jack Welch in the book. He's like, you're in your job every day.
Yeah, one-day contracts.
One-day contracts, exactly, right? And that's also broken and not right, because the issue is how do you create investment in the employee in their career, and how do you create investment in the company such that both the employee's career and the company change trajectory, they transform. And so, kind of as a kind of a biographical anecdote, part of the reason why we ended up writing this book was because we were thinking about like the Startup You, the book that Ben and I did before, and why this was important for companies in terms of thinking about having, entrepreneurial, adaptive talent working there, and that they would need to look at that book to also say, well, this is the kind of talent we want at our companies. We said, well, how do they understand that? Well, part of it is they need to understand that there is this kind of new framework for dealing between employees and companies that both transform the possible outcomes of the company, making it adaptive, and also transform employees' careers.
Actually, an interesting survey of the audience. Who here has read Startup You? So one way to think about the Alliance is if you have an employee who showed up to work wanting to be entrepreneurial, wanting to take intelligent risks, wanting to be adaptive, how do you manage that employee? How do you think about the relationship you craft with that employee? How do you acknowledge the reality that they're probably not going to want to pledge the rest of their life to working at a single company, be it LinkedIn or any other?
And one thing I would add to Reid's response is Reid was talking about the distrust that can ferment as a result of this kind of discussion or lack thereof. And it's interesting because I think one of the reasons this book is so valuable is because it allows for a very open, honest discussion where one might previously not have taken place. And as a result, my experience is that this subject historically has been largely taboo. And the distrust is not really explicit. It's not I don't trust this person doesn't trust me. It's, should we really be talking about this? And it doesn't feel right. Should I let my manager know I'm not going to be here in X number of years? Does the manager want to bring this up and surface it and plant the seed with the employee when they may otherwise not be thinking about leaving? And one of the things I was so excited about when Reid and Ben first walked me through the thesis was allowing all of us to shine a light on a fundamental conversation that everyone should be having, and that is core to our value proposition at LinkedIn, not only for our members, but of course for all of you as employees.
Excellent. Okay, so Reid, the way we organize the Alliance at work is through a framework we call the Tour of Duty. What is the Tour of Duty? How does it work? And what are the 3 types of Tours of Duty?
We had a lot of conversations about naming Tour of Duty, among them with Jeff. And actually, I'll get into a little bit of that detail. One of the things we were really hesitant about is the kind of the military analog, because there's a lot of difference in between military and business and how they operate. But we ultimately decided it was the right frame of all the things that we could think of, because part of what it is it's a mission objective that has a transformational impact on the company, a transformational impact on each employee and individual's career through that, and is accomplishable in a realistic amount of time. And realistic amount of time will depend somewhat on what the project is, what the company is, what the shape of it is. But as a quick analog, there's a reason why in Silicon Valley, where startups are the epitome of transformation of industries, transformation of companies, transformation of individuals' career, that the typical vesting package for a stock that is given in a startup is 4 years, because that's kind of roughly speaking a kind of a amount of time that you can accomplish a serious project, right? Have a transformational impact and see how that works. Now, part of the conversation that we were having with Jeff was, kind of saying, okay, how do you operationalize this? How does this apply to large companies? How does this apply to healthy cultures? All of which, Jeff is the, one of the leading lights on. And part of the thing that when we were kind of talking about this, he said, look, this transformational tour, this is great, but you need to think about some other tours as well. And so the naming of rotational, transformational, and foundational actually came from Jeff in about 4 or 5 conversations. It was a number. Because the thought is you have this one, which is this kind of project. What a foundational tour is that your vision of the impact you want to have on the world, the work that you want to do, is so closely tied to a particular company that you go, look, when I think 5 years out, I just can't think of working at a different company. Like, I think if I'm going to be working at a company, I'm working at this one. And that's what shifts you to essentially a foundational tour, because you're thinking, no, like what I'm doing here, what we are doing, this is the thing that really matters to me. And then a rotational tour is where you actually have in fact, a very fixed kind of time commitment. And there's 2 subparts to rotational. One subpart, the one we have here at LinkedIn in a couple different areas, is where you do a tour of duty, 18 months, 24 months, something, the business analyst program, APM, these sort of things. And then I do that, and then that leads to another job, most likely, but that job is time delimited. And those we generally think of as kind of the elite rotational tours. And then the other rotational tours are also there's large patterns of employment in the US and elsewhere, by which large companies hire fleets of people. And so UPS and drivers, Starbucks and baristas and these sorts of things. And one of the ways to look at each of these tours is they bring different virtues to how a company operates. So in the rotational case, it's scalability, because you can, for example, it's an easy way to roll out to a large number of folks. In the transformational case, it's adaptability, because it's the question of how you have people thinking about how they adapt their own life and work and career and what they're doing, and that makes them much more attuned to what's going on in technology and the market and everything else, and helps the company adapt. And then foundational, which is continuity, which is the notion of, like, this is what our culture is, this is what we're doing, these are what our long laid plans are. And all of these 3 together in many companies are an important mix in order to have the company be healthy and growing into the future.
And our argument is that every employee at a company should be on a tour of duty, right? Every employee should be talking with their manager. Every manager should be initiating conversations with their direct reports to talk explicitly about the alliance. How are we both investing in each other to transform your career, to allow you to transform the company? And which type of tour makes sense? Is it a rotational tour? Is it a transformational tour, which is really the heart of the framework whereby a manager and employee personalize a mission objective and set realistic time parameters? Or is it a foundational tour? Does this employee not conceive of working anywhere else and is really part of the emotional and intellectual foundations of the company? But that spread is important because we do believe that the framework can encompass every employee at the company. And each type of tour duty has different benefits to both parties involved.
And actually, two things to add, just in case my earlier thing. How we got to the three was in conversation with Jeff. So, it's part of the many different intellectual impact that Jeff has had on the book, the work. And the second thing is people frequently presume that transformational means, well, you do this one tour and then you move somewhere else. Actually, in fact, there are people who've worked at one company their entire career, their entire life, doing transformational tours there. It's just the question is you do that mission, you do that project, and then you engage in the next one. And have we published the Right of First Conversation article?
In a couple days.
We're publishing an article about the nature of the conversation, which is the Right of First Conversation, which is the compact that employees and companies have as part of these multiple.
And we'll get into that. Before turning it over to Jeff to hear more about transformation, Reid, can you get a little personal for the group? In the book, we tell a story of how you recruited and attracted talent to LinkedIn in the early days, using the Tour of Duty framework. And we tell the story of Matt Kohler. We also tell the story of David Hahn. Talk about either or both of them.
So one of the things that's kind of interesting is another classic misunderstanding is that people think that all of the founding team are all on foundational tours of duty in a startup. That's actually not the way it works. Actually, the majority of the founding team is actually on transformational tours. And a clear example of that is Matt Kohler, who we both talked about some up in the Startup Review and also in the Alliance. And when I met Kohler, he was an analyst at McKinsey. He had an offer to be a principal at a couple of different venture firms, and he knew that venture capital was the thing he most wanted to do. And so we were sitting and talking about it, and I said, look, the best way to get a great venture capital job is not actually to go work in the venture capital industry right now. And by the way, frequently this is true for the really interesting jobs. It's usually not that kind of straight-on path. In this case, it was go work at early-stage startup companies that are really important, that give you close exposure to VCs, because that's the way that essentially they hire. And so, for example, LinkedIn would be one of those. You can, we're talking about, it's like you could decide to do that, you could not decide to do that. This is not a pitch that you must do LinkedIn, but this kind of company is the right kind of thing. And then you should have people, your network that you're connected to. In this case, he was like, well, actually, I really like LinkedIn, but I really want to work with you, and I agree that that's the way to do it. And so, in order to get a venture capital job, Kohler first came and worked for me here at LinkedIn. This is, basically before our Series A, so kind of part of the founding team, and then went on to do a tour of duty at Facebook, and is now a general partner at Benchmark. David Hahn, very similarly, came in.
So just to pause for a second, so Kohler spent 2 years at LinkedIn?
Almost 3.
Okay, so he was an example. If he did one tour of duty and then shifted to go to Facebook and then to venture firm, and then how does that contrast with Hahn?
Well, so David Hahn, who basically started his career working in Feinstein's office, decided that Silicon Valley was an interesting place to be and wanted to do, before contributing more on the political side, because that's his long-term objective, or I don't know if it still is this year, but it was at least a couple years ago. He wanted to kind of come and participate in this amazing thing that was happening in Silicon Valley. And so he came out, and basically he was working at this other startup that was going in the wrong direction. He knew Keith Raboy, who was an early employee here. And Keith said, look, we've got this really talented guy, we should hire him. And we're like, well, we don't really have any job for him. He's like, well, we'll just call him a business analyst and have him come in and do stuff, right? And no, this isn't a prelude to the Silicon Valley TV show. So he came in and we said, look, we got this work to do. Why don't you kind of be a generalist across the fringes of what we're doing? Because actually generalists are very important in the early stages of these companies. And what he essentially did is he worked his way through a sequence of tour of duty by which he accomplished a bunch of things he was doing. He showed to us his talent and drive and leadership and inspiration. and then essentially got another more important job, but also frequently a very different job to go and learn this. And many of you probably know him, but he was the head of all the money products here before his current tour of duty, which is when he said, look, I want to, LinkedIn has been such an amazing transformational impact. I don't know how I'll ever do something that affects people's incomes and livelihoods and has a mission tied to a great business. I don't know if I'll ever get something like that again, but now I'm actually kind of interested in medicine and what's the right way to do that. And the right way to do that in this case, in conversations, this was conversations with me and with Jeff and other folks, was to say the right thing to do is, okay, let's go to Greylock and be a EIR at Greylock.
So his tenure at LinkedIn was about 9 years?
Yeah, a little over.
So I find that fascinating. You have Kohler at 3 years, Hahn at 9 years. So tour of duty does not necessarily imply 1 year and out, 2 years or out.
Yep.
It's a framework for wrapping honest conversation around a mission objective and a realistic time frame. And there can be a sequence of tours of duty at a single company.
And Ben, it's also important, there's a natural progression. It's not just that you start with a transformational tour and you do multiple transformational tours. I think oftentimes you'll see someone come in on a rotational tour and expect that they're going to be in that first job for 18 months, 24 months. There's a very explicit understanding of that. And then they decide along the way, maybe they just graduated school and they're trying to figure out what they want to do next. They start to determine what it is that they want to do next. And that could be something at the company or outside the company. Say ultimately they want to be a founder and do a startup on their own. They may determine that the best way to learn the skills to do that is to be on a transformational tour within the company. And that transformational tour, to Reid's point earlier, could lead to a second, third, fourth transformational tour, and then you're somewhere 9 years. And I don't think it's unusual at that point for someone to recognize and wake up one day and say, my own personal vision or mission is so closely aligned with this company I've been a part of for so long that this is foundational. So there's also a natural progression, I think, between tours as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jeff, I've heard you say on a number of occasions that you can't imagine working anywhere else other than LinkedIn. So that sounds like a foundational tour to us. Talk about how you and Reid defined that foundational tour and how you conceive of your own employment trajectory here at LinkedIn.
Yeah, so a few thoughts on foundational tour. So first, in terms of Reid and I's understanding of that, that conversation lasted about 30 seconds. And
you may be overstating it.
It's that specific, the duration was literally 30 seconds. Reid and I, to Reid's point, spent about 15 to 20 hours together at least before I joined the company on determining whether or not it was the right fit. In terms of how long we thought we would let this go, we at one point agreed, I think it was a straightforward, I joined as an interim president with the operating role of CEO, but I had just finished a 7-year stretch at Yahoo, and I wasn't sure whether or not I wanted to go back into full-time operations. I was at Greylock and Excel as an EIR, and Reid, of course, was looking ultimately for a full-time CEO, and he drew up two lists, one for interim and one for full-time. And as an EIR at Greylock, I raised my hand and volunteered to help any way I could, and some of the partners said, you should sit down and talk to Reid. And I thought I'd come in a couple days a week and just help him. And I was a huge fan of Reid's. We had met previous to that. And so I sat down with Reid and he said, look, I've drawn up two lists, interim, full-time. You're the only name on both. What do you want to do? And I was like, what? Hey, hello? I thought I'd come in a couple of days per week. So that started a process where the two of us spent a lot of time together. Reid's one of the most thoughtful people I've ever met in every sense of the word. And oftentimes we get asked the question, how did we make this work as successfully as it did? And I believe it started in those discussions. And I'm always encouraging people who are trying to figure out a similar way to undergo a transition like that to avoid the traditional interview process. This was not an interview process. This was a relationship building process. And I think that was core to the success that we've had in our relationship. There's also a lot of mutual respect, and our values and visions are so clearly aligned, so it's not just that, but that was a big part of it. At any rate, when we started talking about duration and tenure, it literally was as fast as, so Reid said, I'll be open to you doing this interim as long as you're open to doing it full-time. I said, sure, and I'll be open to doing an interim as long as you'd be open to having me full-time. He said, of course. And then we said, okay, well, let's do it for as long as it makes sense. That was that was it. And then we shook hands, and that was done. So it's made sense ever since. When I joined, I mentioned that I had previously been at Yahoo for a number of years, and it was the best of times. There were some very challenging times, and I learned invaluable lessons there. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to do ops again to that extent. And literally on my first day here, I walked through the door and I couldn't wipe the smile off my face. It is a true story. I was smiling all day long. Even when things got challenging, there's always challenges, I was still smiling. And it just felt so right on every level. And the longer I've been here, the more obvious it's become to me that this is it. This is the job for me. I quite literally can't imagine doing anything else. And I think ultimately, we were talking a little bit about this earlier, you know, maybe one litmus test for the foundational tour is when you look out 4 or 5 years. Reid mentioned the key 4-year time period earlier. Can you see yourself in another job? And I think it's challenging in this day and age for anyone to predict what's going to happen a few years out, let alone 4 or 5 years out. And my sense is that people might even get a little nervous if they're asked to commit to anything over that long a period of time. But the way Ben framed the question just now, can I imagine doing anything else independent of time frame, to me is one very essential part of the foundational tour. And I cannot imagine doing any other job in the world where I would enjoy it this much. One other thing I'd add on foundational, it's a double entendre. The word's a double entendre. So the highest compliment that anyone has ever paid me in a professional capacity was Reid was in the course of an interview, and someone asked him about our working relationship and my role here, and Reid said he considered me a co-founder. That companies go through multiple foundings, multiple founding moments. I'd never heard anyone frame it that way. And he said he considered me a co-founder. And it just meant the world to me. And when we were thinking about the naming convention, when we were thinking about that last tier, that last tour, foundational has 2 connotations. One is you're part of the foundation, the core fabric and building blocks upon which the company's built. And the other is you're a founder. You think of yourself like a founder. You think of yourself and the company as inextricably linked in terms of the way in which your vision and your commitment, your dedication, what you want to accomplish is so deeply aligned.
And you don't have to be CEO or chairman to be on a foundational tour duty at LinkedIn.
No,
right?
hardly.
You can be at any level of the organization.
Yeah.
If you think there's sufficient overlap between the company mission and your personal mission, if you feel so emotionally connected to the business, it's probably a conversation that has to ensue between the employee and the manager. It's not, an employee doesn't declare him or herself, I'm on a foundational tour at LinkedIn, but it's
they come in wearing a T-shirt saying,
right.
I'm foundational, what about you? We have those in the lobby, by the way.
Yes, exactly, as the parting gift. But it is part of the conversation you can have with the manager, and you can be at any level in the organization and in theory be on a foundational tour duty. And there are people here at LinkedIn who are on foundational tours, who are the cultural stewards of the business, part of the emotional fabric of the company, who may be much lower down in the organization.
I mean, you can hear how articulate Ben is, which is why he's an author many times over. But they're cultural flag bearers. And it absolutely can exist at any level of the organization. And I have had those conversations on multiple occasions with employees who've come in and said, this is it.
Yeah.
I'm home. This is what I've always wanted to do. I love this place. This mission, the vision, what we're trying to accomplish, the impact we're having on the world, I cannot imagine doing anything else.
And I think, Jeff, you introduced us to Brad Smith when we were writing the book, and we tell the story. Brad Smith is the CEO of Intuit in the Alliance, who I believe, but correct me if I'm wrong, did a couple tours of duty at Intuit as transformational tours of duty, and then was hired as CEO. And now his LinkedIn URL is linkedin.com/in/Brad Smith Intuit, which to me is the ultimate indication of that. If your personal identity
Yes.
and the company you work for are so interlinked, that's your URL, you're probably on a foundational tour. So there is a prospect of shifting and transforming into a foundational tour. Okay, Reid, the alumni network at LinkedIn.
Right.
What kind of value are you looking to get out of the alumni network here at LinkedIn?
So, one of the consequences of having folks shift around jobs in different companies is that now, actually, in fact, all companies, or majority, many, have essentially alumni or bases, where people who've gone on to work at other companies, they've had their startups, other large companies, industries, and so forth. And given that this shift from lifetime employment then creates an alumni basis that's young and active, the question is how does that young and active group keep a relationship with the company? Because it can be mutually beneficial, right? This is part of the reason we called it the alliance, because it's an alliance between, and by the way, the alliance can be lifetime. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to work here. It's like, no, I'm a lifetime out.
Lifetime.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
In a winning circumstance for both the individual and for the company, it's a lifetime. And for alumni, part of the thing that you have is, well, you've got this diaspora of former employees. Hopefully you've maintained a good relationship. You can still help each other, right? And so you can help each other with things like, okay, what's going on in the market? What are trends that we should be looking at? Who are interesting people that we might want to recruit? And then this has to be bidirectional from the company. It's like, look, what are the ways that we invest in our alumni? Like, so for example, we invite them to events, we do other sorts of things, we try to share information with them. And this can then be a valuable resource to, for example, the current employees. So for example, I've been asking a bunch of different questions on the alumni group. Like, for example, one of the alumni group questions that I asked was, okay, how are you essentially getting your business news? Because obviously this is one of our strategic objectives, how we're thinking about how we evolve what we're doing here with the influencers program, with Pulse. And we got some stuff that's kind of the obvious, which is, people use Twitter in some ways, use Pulse, obviously. Obviously it's shifting to mobile. But we then also began to get specific, like, look at this app, or look at this feature, or here's a use case that I'm interested in. Those kinds of things, as kind of pulsing a network, bring in network intelligence that allow you to essentially operate more effectively, to move faster, to move more on target, and in fast, rapidly changing environments like Silicon Valley, like software. And this is the clock that's happening in every industry. Every competitive tempo is increasing. You need to move fast and you need to be on target. Well, network intelligence is the best way I know in order to do that. And your alumni, you can have an ongoing alliance by which that's one of the ways that you're helping each other. And that's what we're doing with the LinkedIn alumni group.
And Reid uses the phrase network intelligence. We have a couple of chapters in the Alliance and actually in Startup Review. Startup Review from the individual perspective, the Alliance more on an institutional basis of how can you tap people who do not currently work at the company to get their insights. And this is, I think, something that Reid's the best in the world at both thinking about and doing in practice, which is it all rests on a basic premise, which is no matter how many smart people there are who work at LinkedIn today, there are more smart people in the world who do not work at LinkedIn than who work at LinkedIn. Yep. So the question is...
Any company,
just
not
barely,
just LinkedIn.
Just barely, because you are a smart lot.
Yes, exactly.
So the practical question is, how do all of us tap all of those smart brains to whom we're all connected to on LinkedIn, the product, in order to get intelligence and get insight to make us better at our jobs? And the alumni group is an obvious network of folks that kind of straddle both external and internal. They have still an ongoing relationship to the company. But of course, in the book, we detail how to talk to people who might not be LinkedIn alumni, but might be just smart people in the industry. Maybe they work at Google or Facebook, but have things to teach us all to make us adapt even faster.
And actually, there's a specific part of the network intelligence that's important. There are specific problems you're trying to solve. And sure, there's a bunch of smart people here, and they can help you solve those problems. They do, and that's part of the work. People have encountered those problems before. They've encountered them with different groups. They've encountered them in different circumstances. And actually getting that set of information is one of the things that allows you to operate effectively. It allows, for example, when you're a part of a founding team in a startup, you are going and talking to people about your ideas all the time, because what you get back, half of it you kind of ignore, right? But what you get back can be really critical to how you shift. And by the way, same thing on investing, right? Which is like, well, is this going to win? Are the secular trends, what's happening with technology? What's the future going to look like 3 to 5 years from now? These are all the kinds of things that are much better done with network intelligence.
When Ben describes Reid as being amongst the best in the world at understanding this, the way I think about it is, I remember when we first started talking about this and the thesis that Reid was putting out there, and when he described the vision for it, I got the sense it was part and parcel coming from the same place that you founded the company. And it was very consistent with the way Reid sees the world. And so when you see the title, The Alliance, and working in a networked age, to me this is quintessential in terms of what that means. And I think we all understand it intellectually, but once you grok this and fully internalize the power of maintaining and nurturing and leveraging those relationships and the loyalty and allegiance through the fact you used to work at the same place, but to one another, I think it's a very, very powerful concept.
And the practical advice in the Alliance is to managers on how can you institute programs, policies, philosophies with your team to encourage your people to go external, to ask useful questions, to collect intelligence from the market, and then bring that intelligence back into the office. And we tell some stories from early days of LinkedIn and policies over at Greylock, where there's explicit instructions of go out externally, talk to people, share updates on LinkedIn, tweet about stuff, get intelligence, but then crucially, come back into the office and share what you've learned so we can all adapt even faster. And that last part, I think, is the critical, and we even discuss, can you expense a lunch? Can you talk to your manager about expensing a lunch that you have that may not be related to LinkedIn business specifically, but might be broadly useful industry intel? And yeah, you can expense it on the condition that when you come back to the office, you share what you've learned with your colleagues.
Going to start seeing a lot of expensive lunches coming back. Yeah, I learned some great information. I'll tell you later, but God, that was so delicious.
You got to write it up.
One question for Reid that I think people would find invaluable. So we were talking about how Reid is among the best at this, and certainly in understanding strategically how all of this works. But one thing I've had a chance to observe that I learn from Reid every time I watch him in this setting is the way you nurture these relationships. And I'm not sure it's explicit in the book, but you won't find anyone better than Reid in terms of understanding how to continue to build these relationships and to make sure people feel like they are also generating value from the relationship and feel like it's in both parties' best interest to continue to build that relationship. And it's a sight to behold, but you want to share some of your, I know it comes very naturally,
So lifetime relationships, lifetime alliances are exponentially more valuable than transactional ones. And part of what you think about is, how do you essentially help each other as you go through your work lives? And, people always think, well, does that mean only jump on the grenade and so forth? There's all kinds of little things that you can do for each other, because something that costs you this much. One of the things that I talked about a few years ago is kind of what I had this odd name, theory of small gifts, which is something that only costs me this much, but is this beneficial to someone else. Do those all the time, because that's part of you're telling the other person that you're allies with that you care about the relationship, you care about them, that you want to essentially be allies with them and work together. And then that, obviously, that generosity or that commitment doesn't always get reciprocated, but in that kind of circumstance, it happens more often than you would expect, and it generates massive amounts of value on both sides, because this much cost, this much benefit, this much cost, this much benefit. All of a sudden you get a lot more benefit.
Of a small gift that tends to have outsized impact?
Introductions to people, who are kind of key people you should know. Information or perspective in articles, for example, I ran across this thing that I think would be useful to you, whether it's about LinkedIn, about the industry, in cases of things come to me. Sometimes perspective on how you're operating, hey, you could think about doing this differently or this better. Or do you realize that when you speak this way, you're heard this way, so it might be useful to shift. All of these things are relatively easy for the giver to do, right? Obviously, if you're giving some critical feedback, you have to kind of, figure out how to position it the right way, but that's all good. And then can be massively beneficial on the other side, and those are all examples.
And I guess it's not coincidental that sounds like the LinkedIn product.
Yeah, not coincidental.
Introduction, sharing intelligence.
There's underlying all of it for me when watching Reid and being on the receiving end of it is authenticity. So doing this for the sake of doing it for the sake of getting information out of the other person won't work. People will sense it immediately. Yeah. There is an authenticity to Reid's relationships and the way he so deeply cares about the well-being of the other person and just genuinely wanting to help them. That, to me, is at the root of all of it and one of the reasons it has proven to be so successful.
Yeah, and it's so hard to speak explicitly or think strategically about this topic for that very reason, because the moment one gets a sense of calculation is when you lose that sense of authenticity. In the we face this challenge a lot in Startup Review. We have 20,000 words on networks and relationships. And it's this great irony of saying, the most important thing is to not seem calculated or inauthentic about it, and then here's 20,000 words.
And here's how you think about it.
Detail, yeah. And there's a quote, one of my favorite novelists, Jonathan Franzen, says that the people most obsessed with authenticity tend to be the least authentic people. And I think that's because it carries people obsessed with authenticity tend to make it part of an external playbook, and it feels calculated.
Yeah.
Whereas I think for Reid and Jeff and for so many masters of this, it's truly core to who they are.
You actually don't think about it, because think about, I'm authentic.
So I haven't been a part of this discussion explicitly with the two of them before, but listening to Ben just describe what works and what doesn't work, I say this without any hyperbole. I believe Reid has a genius for this, and we all know Reid's a very intelligent guy. The ability to be doing this in real time, while in conversation with someone, and to not fall out of balance with regard to authenticity, but at the same time understanding what the objective is, I think can prove to be very challenging. But if you can get it right, it's literally invaluable. It's invaluable.
Yeah. Okay, so let's open it up to questions. We have about 20 minutes of questions. Are we lining up, Rochelle?
Yes.
Okay, so you can go ahead and line up at the microphone and ask questions about.
Why don't you ask the Yahoo alumni question?
Okay, yeah, and
Jeff,
so as you
while
guys think of
people line
questions,
up.
well, one more question to Jeff. The premise of the alliance, again, is that lifetime employment may be over, but a lifetime relationship can endure, and that both managers and employees can strive to build a real relationship that can last a lifetime. And one of the striking things about Jeff and the impact he's had here at LinkedIn is how many of his former colleagues he's brought along with him in this journey. How do you think about folks you've worked with in the past? How do you think about the Yahoo alumni base and kind of encouraging folks to sign up for new tours of duty here at LinkedIn? There's obviously a lot of ex-Yahoo people in the audience here, no doubt due to your efforts.
Yeah, we've been very fortunate. I think a number of our senior executives have had a chance to recruit amongst teams that they used to work with, whether it's Yahoo or Google or other large successful companies over time in the Valley. I think it's one of the byproducts of building and continuing to invest in those relationships. But the objective there is not just working with someone you used to work with for the sake of it. Mm-hmm. It's actually one of the most important reasons that I believe longer tenure within companies proves to be one of the most valuable contributors to that company's success over time, and it's shorthand. It's quite simply shorthand. The longer that people work together, the more they understand one another intuitively. The fewer words they need to get a point across. The more they can read body language and instantaneously understand what someone else is thinking. The more they can predict what someone is going to think or feel without them being in the room. And ultimately, in my opinion, the long-term value of a company is tied to primarily one thing, which is the speed and decision with which a company makes quality decisions. The speed and quality with which a company makes decisions. And in order to do that in the right way, you need to build a team that understands one another. And so working with folks that you've had a chance to work with over a long period of time, for me, has proven to be one of the most valuable things that you can do. And so some of those folks were people I used to work with at Yahoo. A lot of those folks are people I've had a chance to work with over a long period of time here. I've been here 5.5 years. Our core executive team has remained largely unchanged. And when we were originally talking about the thesis of tours, I felt very strongly about the fact that the longer the tour, the better. And to me, this is one of the largest misnomers that is common within Silicon Valley, amongst other industries, but really quite prominent in Silicon Valley, which is that someone can't be at the same company for too long. That people feel like they are making a mistake in terms of their career path if they are at a company for too long a period of time, like in excess of X number of years, that they've got to move on to the next new thing, that hot new company, or that people are going to look down on them, believe it or not, that people will look at their career path with a pejorative or negative connotation if they're at the same company for too long. And I couldn't disagree more emphatically with that suggestion. I believe it's the exact opposite. That the most successful people I know in the Valley, the most successful and the most valuable companies in the world are those that have maintained a core nucleus over time. And if you look at the median tenures of the senior executive teams from the most valuable companies, Apple, Google, Amazon, you're going to see the same thing every time. That group of people have been working together for 8, 10, 12 years. Take a meeting at Apple with some senior executives. They'll talk at times about being there 18 years, 14 years. So I believe the ability to recruit from groups of people that you've built that kind of relationship with, where you have that shorthand, I think it's absolutely critical to a company's success.
And the very final note before we get to questions, because now we have a line of folks, is part of how Jeff ended up with this job was through Alumni Network, because James Slavitt had used to work for you, and James recommended you to me.
James, who's a partner at Greylock
Yes.
at the time.
Right. So just
That's exactly right.
in terms of how those work. So
Okay, fire away.
Hi, Reid. I'm Patrick Moore. I was employee 32
Yes,
back when
I
we were in
remember.
El Camino.
yes.
Very tiny office there. So right now, I'm at VP of Engineering at WhalePath, which
By the
is
way, speaking of alumni,
Yeah.
So how many alumni do we have in the audience? So we invited,
few,
part of the alumni network, we have 10 alumni here, which is awesome. Continue.
Yeah. So actually, it's funny is LinkedIn was transformational. In fact, that was the first engineering job I had that was 9 to 5. It was astounding for my wife. But it was actually transformational for our love life. So
now, that was not a subject I was expecting.
So anyhow, we're actually, so briefly about WhalePath, we do on-demand business research for corporations, but we, interestingly enough for us, we require students to be LinkedIn members to log in and use our system and to register for the research positions. Now what we do is we put them together as in teams, and we make them work virtually and stuff like that to give them the first job experience. And I'd like to talk to you more about that later, but my question is actually related to the beginning of this talk, which was employees and managers both know the little lie that no, I'm not going to be here in 20 years for most people. But as if you're an employee, in less of a power position than VP or CEO, it's very, so my wife is not in a power position per se, but it's very hard for her to have a conversation to her manager that says, by the way, I just want to let you know that I plan on leaving. Because usually it starts with, okay, so you're giving me you're giving the 2 weeks notice, why don't you just leave now? So it's a very economically dangerous position for an employee. So I'm wondering, I don't think you've ever been in that relationship, Reid, but
It's a great
question.
Address that.
So we actually address it in the book. It's actually written about in the book because it's seriously important. And part of what we suggest is that one of the things is you have sometimes a power imbalance where the employee says, look, I'm at more risk here, so I can't bring this topic up. So what we exhort managers to do is to bring it up in a safe and good way in order to build trust, because that's one of the things that managers essentially want to do. So it doesn't mean you have to force it as an employee. If your manager's not bringing it up, if you can't figure out a way to bring it up, then don't. But that's part of the primary target for the Alliance is actually people who are managers, who are in management positions, in order to say, you need to bring that up. And the way you can bring it up is say, look, we understand, look, we'd love you to work here a long time. We hope that multiple tours would be done here, but we also want to make sure that we're investing in each other the right way and we're having the right outcome for your career. And in the book, we have various, it's like having the conversation. I forget the exact, like how to have the conversation is part of the pragmatic stuff. So it's an excellent question. And, that.
Stay tuned.
Yes.
Okay.
So one other thing on that last point is to emphasize the value and importance of trust. And we were talking about why it's so valuable to be working with the same group of people over time. And an old friend once taught me that trust equals consistency over time. And so the longer you have a chance to work with someone, I think the more likely there is for trust to be there. And when you have a trusted relationship with someone else, it's much easier to have that discussion. It also requires a lot of maturity on both sides and a lot of forethought. So what kind of succession planning is in place? Do you trust that the other person is going to still be locked and loaded despite the fact that they know that X amount of months or years from now they're going to be leaving and they're still going to give it their all while they're in the role? And to be able to have that dialogue very openly, very constructively, I think is paramount to making that work. And it's not easy, but if you can do it properly, I think it pays enormous dividends because you're not guessing.
And contributes to retention. I think it's the central paradox of the alliance conversations is that one of the best ways to increase retention is to talk openly with your employees about the fact that they can and maybe will leave someday. Because only by bringing it and framing the conversation in that way can you talk constructively about defining a mission objective that's mutually beneficial to entice them to stay over a long period of time.
Ben, it's not just staying. It's also just about their well-being. And I don't know that I've ever shared this anecdote with the broader group, but it makes a lot of sense in this context. So at one point at a former employer of mine, I gave notice. It was long before I actually left the company. And my boss said I couldn't leave, that it wouldn't be the right thing to do for my boss, that person's peers, other executives, my team, the company more broadly defined. There was no contractual obligation or anything along those lines, but it did get my attention, and I felt like it might not be the right thing to do, but I wasn't happy in the role. At that time, I wasn't happy at all. And I ended up staying, and the learning I did over the subsequent 18, 24 months was absolutely invaluable, and I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for that. So everything happens for a reason. However, I was not happy, and it took a toll on me. And I was energy I brought home, and it just wasn't a good situation. One of my directs came to me about a year and a half after that, and this was a person who led in large part through personality. Just an amazing person to be around, super talented and just a great person. And I could see inside of them that they increasingly were not happy. And it was very painful for me to watch. I felt responsible for this person, and I knew they weren't at their best. And they sat me down in a conference room and they said, I've been talking to other companies. We had tremendous trust with one another. I've been talking with other companies. I just want to let you know, because I didn't want you to find out the wrong way, but you should also know, I'm not leaving you. I won't leave you here. I would never do that to you. And I just want to know what else was out there. And I said, if you think you're making me happy by staying while you're miserable, I have to correct you. If you want me to be happy, you'll be happy. And he was not expecting that response. And he ended up leaving and pursuing a different career, and he's never looked back. But that was a pretty valuable lesson that I learned. What was communicated to me and then what I communicated to this person. And ultimately to me, and this may sound like a line, and it's not, what ultimately matters most is the happiness of your employees. And if they're not happy in the role they're in currently, you should do everything within your power to help them to be happy. And if that can't happen at our company, then help them do it somewhere else. But that ultimately is how you build lasting relationships, relationships that will long exceed whatever tenure you're thinking about at your current company.
Very tough to follow that.
And now the next question.
First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us firsthand all of these experiences and what you think, and letting us ask you questions. My question is about the Alliance. How do you see this working across cultures and regions? Like, have you talked to managers, frontline managers in Brazil, in Singapore, India?
We have started. It's a great question. We part of the anchor was we thought at the very beginning of the book, and by the way, our third co-author is here, Chris, wave, right. We thought about whether or not we'd do one of two kinds of book. One kind of book is we do exhaustive research for 5 to 7 years, we report on it, etc. The other kind, which is not the kind of book we did, the other kind of book is we said, well, we think that there's a bunch that's super important that's happening here in Silicon Valley that a lot of folks can learn from. And it's not to say that we'll have it perfect. It's not to say that as you look at the meld between this in different industries, different regions, different countries, different cultures, that there will be some mods, because we're essentially strongly anchoring. We did do, I had conversations with, the CEO of Coke and, a bunch of other, but like, we understand that this is kind of this is the way the world's changing. This is something we've really learned from Silicon Valley. This really helps both employees and companies. It helps adaptability. So put that out there and then start having the deeper conversations, because, we get we just having a conversation this morning about how this fits with Japan and Korea, for example, right? And it was like, well, actually, in fact, part of it may very well be is you say, look, actually in our culture, there is a longer, you might spend, a higher percentage of people might spend their entire career still at one company. The notion of transformational missions, mission objectives, transforming your career, transforming the company are still all apply, right? So it's kind of the question of, all right, let's figure out for this industry, for this culture, for this region, what is the right fit, but it's still the right vector to be moving in. And that's essentially what we're trying to do with the book.
Thank you. It was very brave to put it out there, and I hope it takes on.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Steven. I'm an intern on the web dev team. I actually have two questions. I'm in college right now, so my first question is, what would you guys, if you were in college and about to start a career, what steps would you take to ensure a transformational path and then eventually a foundational path? And then my second question is, I've read your book, Reid, on startup. What other books would you say have made an impact on you as a startup founder?
Okay, so why don't you take the first one?
Sure. So for the sake of brevity, there are three things to bear in mind when thinking about your career path. First and foremost is asking yourself a pretty straightforward question that sometimes is a little more challenging to answer, which is ultimately, what is it that you want to accomplish? So look out 20 to 30 years from now. Looking back on your career, what do you want to say you did? And I think when you're graduating school, it's perfectly reasonable to not necessarily know the answer, but you'd be surprised how many people 10, 15 years into their career still don't know the answer to the question because they get swept up in this stream of opportunity. A promotion here, an offer from a hot company over there, and they wake up one day and they're not happy and they're trying to figure out why, and it's because they never stop to ask themselves what it is that they ultimately want. And if you don't know the answer to that question, try optimizing for two things. One is passion and the other is skill. And it's not one at the exclusion of the other, because that'll lead to some pretty suboptimal outcomes. So that's one, know what it is that you want to accomplish. As simple as it sounds, it's really, really important. Two is surround yourself with great people. I used to think this was all about finding the right boss or the right mentor, but it's not just about the person above you, it's about the people you work with, your peers, and the people that work for you. It's all about talent in this day and age, and so you have to surround yourself with the best, only the best. And then third is to always be learning and to take great passion, if you can, in improving yourself and to challenge yourself. Joey Ito, a very dear friend of Reid's, once described to me the meaning of the word neoteny, which I had never heard of. And in nature, in the animal kingdom, it's a delayed state of adolescence. And so for an animal, that can be a very challenging thing if you're out in the wild and the strength of that animal doesn't fully mature. But in human beings, it can also mean maintaining a childlike sense of wonder in the world and a joy in learning. And I think we would all benefit from that, especially in terms of our career paths.
And then in terms of book, very quickly, Ben's first book about his path as a very young CEO, his entrepreneurial efforts, part of how Ben and I got to being allies and partners on Startup View and the Alliance. Second is Founders at Work by Jessica Livingston, gives a bunch of interesting titles. And then a sequence of books by Brad Feld. And those would all be things for early entrepreneurship to look at.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Devi. I'm an intern in the business analytics team and I go to Cal. My question is, people usually leave their firms not because of their the culture of the firm, but because of their managers. So managers are in a very difficult position. They have to be like the beacons of the culture, as well as answer to their bosses, as well as have direct reports. So what advice would you give to the managers who also who are like in the dilemma of creating a culture of trust? Because we discussed about how this mutual benefit and mutual investment will create a win-win for both the parties. But trust is at all-time low usually. Like nobody really trusts their manager immediately. So what would your advice be to such managers?
Wow, that's...
I said immediately.
Yeah, you said that with a lot of authority. I hope that's not the case.
So over a period of time, you build a trust. But how does a manager kind of be in that situation who wants to create a culture of trust and also be answerable to his bosses where they are trying to accomplish some goals, like in consulting or in finance, where you really have hard stop goals at the end of the quarter?
So let me start and then pass it over to you. So part of the point on the alliance was to say that one of the early ways that you can establish trust is by being genuine and frank and open and transparent. So for example, and this is a little bit like to Patrick's earlier question, really frequently this question has to come from the manager as opposed to the employee in order to think about like what is the kind of career trajectory might be. And if you are tangibly saying, look, what I care about you, right, is where you end up. And how do we help this transformational tour help the company and you? That goes a good long step towards building that kind of trust. Because it's like, oh, by asking that question and by having that conversation, you are also tangibly indicating that you care about me and the outcomes as well. And that is kind of one part of it, and there's much longer, which I think Jeff will get into some of. This goes so far as that one of the questions that Kevin Scott most often asks here when he's interviewing a new person is say, what job do you want after LinkedIn? Because he is trying to show that it's like, look, what we're about is transformational impact. Right? I want you to do great stuff here, but I also want it to be great stuff for you, and it's not once you're here, we're not going to think about going anywhere else. And that's the degree to which you can establish, super great relationships for this.
Just a few things to add. I couldn't agree more on being open, honest, and constructive. And I think that's a foundation upon which you're building trust. It has to be done consistently over time. And the moment you introduce inconsistency into the relationship, you're essentially resetting the trust bar. And trust is one of those funny things that takes a long time to build up, and it can be lost in an instant. So it's really important that people continue to invest and cultivate trust. Lastly, and perhaps above all else, at least for me personally, it's about managing compassionately and walking a mile in the other person's shoes, seeing the world through their lens and perspective, not simply feeling what they feel, which is empathy. Empathy is an important building block for compassionate relationships, but it's maintaining enough distance where you can do something about the way that person feels. And I think one of the most important parts about managing compassionately is not assuming ill intention on behalf of the other person. And we all have a tendency, especially when we become emotional or upset or irritated or angry, to immediately jump to, well, this person has some kind of nefarious intention, or they don't understand what it is I'm trying to talk about, as opposed to saying, I wonder why they're coming to the table the way that they are. Did they have a bad day? Did something happen to them 3 years ago, long before they met me, which I just triggered? Has anyone taken the time to explain to them why this works the way that it does? I mean, there's a litany of questions that you could ask yourself if you're starting to put yourself in their shoes. And I think that has the potential to just completely transform the relationship.
Thank you.
So let's keep the next question short and the answer short. So
Great, thanks. Look forward to reading the book. My question is about loyalty. So I think in today's environment, we're living in a time where tours of duty may be 4 years, 3 years, 2 years, and especially due to the Valley and due to the great products that we're building, every person in the room is probably and is getting offers every week, right? And thinking about, I could go elsewhere. So how do we instill and promote loyalty so that we're not tipping to the end of pushing towards constant transformation and next plays within a company? Great
question. The part of the whole notion of having a tour of duty and having a transparent, open, honest, constructive conversation is that part of what loyalty is one part is we've engaged in this project together, and we're going to see this project through, both from the company side and the employee side. And so essentially, breaking that agreement is it's not a legal contract, but it's kind of ethical. It's like, I'm doing something bad on either side. And then similarly, one of the things, this is the foreshadow to kind of this piece we're going to be publishing, the right of first conversation, is that part of the ethical obligation on both sides is to say, well, for the next tour of duty, we owe each other the right of first conversation. We owe each other the right to have that conversation in order to say, well, what should the next tour be? It doesn't mean both of them might say, well, the company might say this doesn't work for me, the employee might say it doesn't work for me. That's fine, but that right of first conversation, and those two things together are part of what we think is genuine and deep and effective loyalty in the modern world, as long as you are keeping those tours of duty and you're having these open and transparent conversations.
The only thing I would add is probably two dimensions. One is alignment. I think loyalty springs oftentimes from alignment of vision, alignment of values, alignment of what it is that you're ultimately trying to accomplish. I think that's a critical building block. I think the other thing that promotes loyalty is looking out for one another and doing things for someone else. Doing things sometimes not that will benefit you, but just benefits them. And doing it not for an outcome, but because it's the right thing to do. And I think the more we do that for one another, the more loyalty is generated.
I think we're out of time. If those who didn't get a chance to ask a question, you can ask the question on the Alliance LinkedIn group. And let's have a round of applause for Reid and Jeff.
Thank you.